Good afternoon from South Africa, and good evening in China, and good day to wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is the second session of the Africa Security Partnership with China, Looking to the Future. My name's Timothy Walker. I'm the Maritime Project Leader and a Senior Researcher here at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa. I've been currently implementing a project looking at strengthening African maritime security institutions over the next 10, 20, 50 years. And one of the key factors which will be involved in that throughout will be the presence and partnership of China. I'm delighted that we'll be able to have a discussion today with a number of fantastic experts who will be able to touch on maritime as well as land development and security issues around the Belt Road Initiative. Now, we see Africa, in a sense, as a very large island. It is connected to the rest of the world through predominantly maritime routes, maritime interfaces through ports. You'll often see visual shorthands of maritime trade and industry, or even relations with other countries, using images of ports, of cargo, of ships. Now, a lot of that will come from, or is destined to go to China. I'd like to also add personally that I started my academic career with a master's thesis on China. And I'm delighted that I'd be able to blend in my academic past with a professional future, and present, I should say, where we're looking at oceans governance, Belt Road Initiative, development initiatives, and interests going forward. I'd just like to also add, before handing over to the speakers, that we've heard that this is the 20th anniversary of the first FOCAC meeting. And it's an opportunity as well, not only to look forward, but to reflect on the past and the journey which took us to this time. Speaking of journeys, it would be remiss of me not to mention the voyages or journeys of Admiral Chung Hare. I do apologize for some of the pronunciations there, who featured a lot in the discourse over the last 10 and 20 years, particularly around Africa-China relations. It featured a lot in the discourse. So did, as Ambassador Suklal mentioned earlier, the debate at the time over systems of knowledge we can use to understand what China-Africa relations mean. And I'm really pleased that there are two of South Africa's foremost contributors of knowledge over the last 10 years joining us, who've really been at the leading edge. Now, the development angle that we're taking here and the security optics which we're sometimes looking at this and framing this session are not always very clear. And be looking forward to discussing that with the participants today and hearing their presentations. But I would just reflect on what the Chinese ambassador mentioned earlier about the concrete actions. And we heard from Professor Jiang as well, the international public goods which have been in evidence over the last 10 years, connecting finally to what Sinusha Naidu mentioned as well, around the development plans, the interlinkages which are going to occur, and like I say, underpinned or anchored, if you will, by the concrete actions which have been taken. With that, I'd like to now hand over to our first speaker, Dr. You Shan Wu. You now have the floor.
Thank you very much. I just want to say a special thanks to the ISS for inviting me to this important discussion. And it's also just so great to see so many familiar faces and names. So I wanted to start off with, well, actually use the title of this session as a springboard for my intervention, which is the future of China-Africa security cooperation and the role of the BRI. And I found this title particularly interesting, but also challenging to think about. Because on one hand, when we think of the FOCAC process, especially since 2012, this is where we very much see Africa-China security cooperation take place. At the same time, when we look at the BRI and cooperation on the BRI between Africa and China that follows 2012, we see this relationship largely transpire in terms of economic development. So the question really is whether the BRI is fit for purpose regarding security issues, specifically traditional security. So I really wanted to explore this intersect and possibly raise more questions than answers. To start, we have to ask, and I think Sinusha alluded to this earlier, what does the BRI mean to Africa? I think more broadly, when we ask what the BRI means, it seems to mean different things to different people, what some scholars call multi-purpose. So some may emphasize their geographic prism, specifically land and maritime networks. And if we think in the case of Africa, this would be the role of countries such as Djibouti, Egypt, and Kenya in terms of maritime trade routes. More recently, however, I think the BRI represents the common interests of China and its partners. And really, these interests have evolved to include the digital space as well as a proposal of a health Silk Road. And of course, we are also aware then of the interpretation of competitors to the BRI who may highlight the geopolitical implications of the initiative. But at present, and in the physical sense, we know that the BRI links to Africa in a very tangible and pressing way through continental industrialization, specifically in alignment with, as we heard earlier, development strategies, and also the role of transport infrastructure that not only helps in terms of continental integration, but also to integrate Africa into other regions of the world. And we saw this interpretation culminate in late 2020 when China and the AU signed a cooperation plan to jointly promote building the BRI. So I think it's important to understand how Africa conceptualizes the BRI. And I say this because assumptions set the boundaries for relations. And the question is whether our assumptions are fit for future purpose. So should the BRI, for example, expand beyond its current focus on continental industrialization? Looking ahead, so I'm going to then raise, I think, 3 broad points that relate to the BRI and security in Africa. I think we normally may look at the security and BRI components as separate then, but I think there will be increasing intersections, if not in traditional security sense, but in terms of commercial stability. So the first point is an obvious link to traditional security, and that is for us to consider what the implications are of closer economic ties as well as connectivity, especially in the context of the African continental free trade area, and also an increased reliance on transport infrastructure like ports. I think these connections could naturally evolve beyond economic purpose. For example, we know countries like Djibouti, its ports and connection to maritime and sea, oceans, is not just economic, but also serves a military and navy function. My second point, and I think this has come up quite a bit, is the fact that the BRI raises the role of issues to consider beyond the traditional security ambit, for example, digital to health. I think we've already seen a glimpse of Africa and China cooperation and collaboration in terms of non-traditional security. If we think of the 2014 Ebola crisis and how they work together, as well as in terms of combating illicit wildlife trade, as we see through the FOCAC agenda. What will be particularly interesting is to see the type of role that China could play or will play in Africa's post-COVID reality, because I think the circumstances have somewhat changed since 2014 during the Ebola crisis, where there appeared to be a lot more international cooperation during 2014, whereas I think in this year under COVID-19, we also see the limits to globalization as well as international cooperation, where one academic described the general response to the virus has been embedded in global power and diplomatic wrangles from the very start. My last point about the future of security and the BRI is also perhaps what we mean by security could be evolving under BRI relations. We've heard a lot about the security development nexus. And I think on one hand, there is an emphasis on the stability of long-term development as a solution to human security. But I think as relations evolve, so will there be exposure to new kinds of risks and new approaches to mitigating them. So for example, we're also seeing an increasing emphasis on legal arrangements. So for example, how to safeguard repayments against reckless borrowing. And this appears as also an interest for perhaps to provide security against risks as a precursor to development. I think overall, though, if we had to bring in the FOCAC process, we see a lot more drive for predictability in relations that brings a sense of security. If you think of the increased institutionalization and formalization of Africa-China relations, not just in BRI agreements, but in a range of areas under the FOCAC process, such as the security space, where we heard about side forums, the formalization of cooperation, training, and exchanges. So I'm going to end off and conclude by saying I think it's going to be interesting to see how the BRI develops and plays out on the continent. We've already heard this debate and discussion about how I think there are different levels of engagement. We see greater Pan-African approach to security issues. And at the same time, I think the relationship with China is still largely and qualitatively bilateral in nature. If we think about, this is the level where naval bases are set. We also know that 46 African states have signed individual agreements related to the BRI. So I suppose I have an overarching question to end off with, which is, should the FOCAC process and the BRI be harmonized, or do they reflect different aspects of relations? And perhaps closer to home then, is there actually space to refine and conceptualize Africa's ties to the BRI beyond an economic purpose? Thank you. I will leave it here.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested to hear what your answer is to the question you've posed as well at some stage as well, because it's a fascinating one, which I think not many people have actually considered when we talk of, if it's railroad investments, port investments. Sometimes they're not always well connected, but it's all kind of bundled together, and it becomes a real buzzword, which doesn't often, I think, lead to the kind of intellectual or sort of interpretive clarity which you were saying is so required here. I really valued what you were saying as well around moving beyond the traditional security ambit and what new types of understandings of security mean, especially from an African perspective, and what you might think is required in terms of integration from Africa to meet China halfway on some of these matters as well. There's a lot of long-term planning. You've mentioned the Pan-African approach, which is increasingly evident, but also that there's a number of bilateral initiatives as well, which are not often kind of being coordinated maybe from the African side. One thing I'd just like to ask, because we have a few minutes before we can listen to the next speaker, is talking a little bit more about how the African Continental Free Trade Agreement might feature in this. You've mentioned that ports will be important in the future, that coastal communities are likely to be the sites of growth in the future, because this is where the major interfaces are in the rest of the world. How do we bring in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement into this discussion as well?
Thanks, Tim. Well, I think if we look at the ACFTA, my immediate thought is closer integration of the continent, not just, well, to start probably in the economic sense, but I raise the issue largely because we are probably only thinking through the economic prism, but what does it mean for increased, perhaps human contact, closeness through transport infrastructure? I think when we think of transport infrastructure, it's not just in terms of economic focus. It could be in terms of security. What is the impact of, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic on this idea of closer continental integration as well? So I think there are those elements that we need to think about rather than perhaps immediate interests of closer connectivity.
Mm. And is that a role we've heard about the African Union in the past as well? There's a kind of a many multi-layered and overlapping sometimes regional group of bodies as well. We heard the African Union is a member of FOCAC as well. Who can be helming this, if I can use a kind of a maritime metaphor in that regard? Like I say, it's not a security issue, it's not a development issue. It needs a broad focus in that regard. Are there African champions as well at maybe the state level who would take this forward as a regional priority as well?
I think it depends really in terms of the FOCAC process who is co-chairing. So we had South Africa previously, now we have Senegal. So it depends on what the emphasis, I suppose, of the different co-chairs are. I think it is always difficult because we talk about one partner that has relations with several African states. So as I mentioned, the relationship operates both at a multi country level as well as bilaterally. There is always a question, I think scholars often ask whether, there are contradictions between the two, can they fit together? I would say it really depends on the issue. I think that there can be, African states can work together on specific issue-specific things. I don't think it will be a case of there will always be a common position towards China on every issue.
I understand, yes. And one of the final things I just leave with one more question, if that's okay. You mentioned the traditional security ambit, and you mentioned the very good example of health. We cannot obviously put aside the fact that we are in a COVID world and a post-COVID kind of world we'll be entering hopefully soon. You mentioned Ebola as well in the past as one of those issues. But what are some of the other non-traditional security issues which you think either will come up in the discussions or are likely to feature in discussions going forward?
So I think one I mentioned was then in terms of mitigating risks in terms of business agreements. I think that we may see an increasing emphasis of. I think both sides have realized and learned that there needs to be a lot more, it can't be excess borrowing. I think that may not be good for the continent, but also for China in the future. So I think there's that element. Another element regarding the future and non-traditional security risks, I think perhaps to change that around to talk about how to alleviate future risks. And I think you may be aware there has been increasing emphasis on training under the FOCAC process in 2018 under all sorts of cooperation areas. And I think that's important, but even in the case of military or security training, we can't just focus on hardware and training in terms of providing knowledge and experience. It's also something that I find important is the tacit knowledge. So do you understand one another's environments, cultures, language, and way of thinking? So I think increasing that is, I suppose, an emphasis even in the FOCAC process where there is importance in bringing understanding beyond specific issues.
I completely agree with you. We don't really need to have everything seen as a security matter. Highlighting some things now so that they do not become security matters in the future is crucial. And that kind of tacit knowledge and agreements or interactions are crucial. Perhaps the South-South cooperation has been a term used a lot in the past, which we could explore how that can factor in as well going forward. Dr. You Shan Wu, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for the answers to these questions as well. I now look forward to handing over the floor to Li Wentiao. The floor is now yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me voice?
Loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Walker. So I thank you for the invitation of Chinese Embassy to South African and Institute for Security Studies. And Kicker, and I'm from the CICR, China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. We often say Kicker, CICR. CICR and ISS has a long-time academic cooperations. And you just reaffirmed the FOCAC. I still remember, and in 2012, the FOCAC, it is the first time for China to launch and the China-African Security Project and Initiative. So also in this year, the FOCAC and strengthened our two institutes' academic friendship. And our two institutes participate in FOCAC 10+10 think tank cooperation program. And before the COVID-19 epidemic, and we maintained frequent academic exchanges. So I think it is, fortunately, and we can continue our discussions. And in these sessions, the topic is about BRI and Sino-African security cooperations. And before I discuss this topic, I would like to share my observation of African political and security and situations. I think after the COVID-19 epidemic, the continent faced more challenges than any other regions. And we can see that currently, without the external help, it is difficult for many African countries to contain the epidemic. And I just heard that the head of the African CDC, and he said that he wants 6% of continental populations get vaccines by 2022. But until now, only 2% population get vaccines. Of course, the South African is higher, the percentage is higher than other countries. But I think it is really a tough time for Africa now. And in the meantime, African economy suffered a lot. According to the IMF Economic Outlook report, and this year, Sub-Saharan African economic growth is 3.4%. It is weaker than the 6% for the rest of the world. And in this year, and the outlook is China is 8.5, American is around 6, India maybe 7 to 8. So I think many African governments have limited policy space to support the crisis response and recovery. And in terms of the livelihoods, per capita income has returned to 2013 levels. So it means in the past 8 or 9 years, the livelihood development maybe disappeared. As we know, Africa keeps the highest population growth. The continental population is growing at 3% a year. If national GDP cannot match the fast population's growth, more and more concern is rising. And many African societies is fragile or conflict affected. And in sub-Saharan African, and employment fell by about 8.5% last year. I think it will be very risky, and with this high unemployment. And after epidemic, and in some African countries, the economic crisis evolved into a social crisis and a security crisis. Unrest in Africa is increasing. And 3 coups happened, in Mali twice, and just this month in Guinea. And the Chad's president and killed. And what is more concerning is that the regional big powers like Ethiopia, South Africa, Nigeria become more turbulent. I think this is more concerning and for me. So I think what happened in Africa now is very concerned by China. And African political and situation is more directly relevant to China's foreign policy. And we can see, and Chinese citizens were kidnapped, and in the Gulf of Guinea and in the Sahel. And Chinese companies and people, and were evacuated from the territory of Ethiopia. And after the coup d'etat of Guinea, I think some Chinese companies is really worried about the situations in Guinea. And as we know, it is very important and for China's and imports, and we import half of its aluminum ore from the Guinea. So, and we often see that, and in China's official statement, we often see that developing countries is the foundation of our foreign policy, and African is the foundations and foundation. And now China faces a more complicated and international environment. So I think currently the African strategic role in China's foreign policies is more important than before. And we also emphasize the Chinese African policies, and we emphasize to build the China-African community with a shared future. So a stable, peaceful, and prosperous African continent is in China's interest. And I think next is what can we do in the future? What kind of cooperation and can help African and can guarantee a stable and sustainable Sino-African relations? And today we talk about BRI. Yes, I think BRI is relevant, is directly relevant to China-African security cooperation. But I first want to say the BRI is an initiative. It is not a geopolitical strategy or club. If there's no BRI, China still need to strengthen the security cooperations with Africa. And some people and scholars and its logic is that the BRI is Chinese and strategy, so China needed to strengthen the security engagement overseas to implement the BRI. And I think the logic is wrong, or maybe misunderstandings. And we know that before the BRI, China also has matured cooperation mechanisms and many economic programs and engagement in Africa. We have FOCAC, we have go out policies. So the BRI, I think, is just a public good proposed by China. This benefit can be shared by the whole world. I think the most important element of BRI is multilateralism. And the principle of BRI is extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits. So I think Sino-African security corporations maybe can learn something from the BRI spirit. And China and African countries need to have extensive consultations, I think, in the peace and security field. So, but I think now is not enough. And currently, we do not form the regular security consultation mechanisms. And second, I think, yes, I think in the future, China should be a big country or be a great power, and China should take more responsibility and have more engagement and in African peace and security issues and contribute more. But I think, firstly, we should avoid some mistakes made by some big powers or Western powers in Africa. I think we must contend in the interference or interventions, implosions out of self-interest. And I just heard in the last sessions and scholars talk about the African people should be in the driver's seat. Yes, I agree at this point. The African countries' ownership and the leadership should be respected. And I still believe that the most efficient approach is depend on the local government and the security force. The most sustainable approach is to help Africa and for the China's safety and in Africa is to help Africa improve its own security capabilities. And in the past, some big powers, they maybe send troops or hire the mercenary army to protect its interests. But I think in a long time, it often produced a very negative consequence or influence in Africa. So I think, and in the meantime, and to my own understandings, and we still have and more cooperation potentials to explore. And for example, like the shutter diplomacy should be more active in China. Currently, we just have a Chinese African representative, and this post is launched in 2007 in Sudan and Darfur crisis. I think it's really a contribute and for the China's security engagement in Africa. I think in this point, and we can have we should be more active, and maybe we can at a request of African counterparts, and China and African countries can have joint escort in the Gulf of Guinea. And we talk about in the UN Security Council, we still have something we can do. As we know, and China is a permanent member of the UN Security and Council. And in general, and African usually has three and non-permanent members. So I think the cooperations among China and the 3 African countries should be strengthened and in the UN Security Council. And I think in this way, and we can let and the African voice more loudly and in the UN Security Councils. Also, and China can provide training and tactical support for the African security forces, or like to build a standby force. Now, I think China and start to do something. For example, we support and AU and provide some military and assistance, security assistance. And the third point is that the Sino-African security corporations should focus on the social safety nets. We must be cautious that the epidemic causes systematic crisis in the fragile African countries. It is not just only a public health crisis. It may refer to economic, political, ethnic, social aspects. So I think it is impossible to safeguard the social and safety nets only from the 1 or 2 aspects. And in recent years, and the Chinese government, we always emphasize the holistic approach or holistic view to national security. I think, and this security and philosophy, maybe it is also suitable, maybe for African crisis response or management. Of course, I think the most critical thing is to safeguard the people's livelihood. And I hope the upcoming FOCAC in the end of this year can pay more attention and in this field, and like in the food security issues, the climate change. As far as I know, the climate changes may be a very important content and in this FOCAC. And last but not the least, I think both China and African countries must be against the geopolitical zero-sum game in the continent. And in the Cold War, Africa suffered a lot from the Cold War. And most of the conflicts in Africa caused by the external powers zero-sum game. So I think China will not and will never push the African countries to against other countries. But also China will also strongly resist the other countries to disturb the Sino-African relations and undermine the Chinese legitimate interest, particularly on our core interests, like sovereignty issues. So that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. That was spot on 15 minutes. I was watching the clock and loved the timing there. I just very briefly want to just discuss some of those matters which you've raised, because they're fascinating. I think they do have huge long-term implications, which we need to always be bring front and center. The importance of matching GDP to population growth forecasts is crucial. Africa is a continent in which there will be a huge youth population in the years to come. and whether there will be a sufficient economic livelihood is a crucial topic to bear in mind as well now, because most of that will be, I think, of a maritime or a export orientated angle, given that there will be a lot of coastal population, I believe, increase in the future. And as you mentioned at the end, with food security, whether there will be enough food, fish to be supply nutritional needs in the future as well. And I really enjoyed the bit you mentioned as well about the zero-sum game nature, and how often we do fall into the trap of simply characterizing China-Africa relations or relationship with China in those terms as well. And going back to what we heard earlier on about thinking of the win-win partnership, it's very clear, I think, to a lot of people in Africa that China will, in effect, win something. It's a question I would put to you later on, because we don't have time right now to engage further. But what does Africa need to do to also win in this regard? What more does it need to do in that regard to benefit from the potential of the Belt Road Initiative? Those are some topics we could tackle a bit later on. For now, I'm delighted, though, to hand over to Kobus van Staden. Kobus, the floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for ISS for this kind invitation. It's a thrill to be on this panel with all of these other amazing experts. So I think one of the kind of important issues to keep in mind is that with the BRI comes the issue of connectivity. Obviously, connectivity lies at the heart of the BRI, and we're talking there about the connectivity of governments, but also the kind of the actions and connectivities caused by multiple Chinese actors in Africa and multiple African actors. So, I think it's really important to kind of start kind of disaggregating all of those actors and to talk about the complexity, the full complexity of what these engagements bring to the continent. And one of the effects is that the field of peace and security itself has many connectivities, and China-Africa relations bring these connectivities to full visibility, and these include kind of connectivities between the peace and security, which we tend to think of frequently as happening at the government or army or those kind of levels, with issues like policing and law enforcement, for example, which as we've seen in South Africa a few months ago, the overlap between policing and law enforcement on the one hand and peace and security on the other is very close, very kind of diffuse, and it's very difficult to kind of pull those apart. So so in my work, I've been following a few kind of dynamics that I think would be useful to kind of to raise here. Just kind of to provide some examples of what this kind of complex connectivity looks like. In the first place, we've seen a lot of, obviously over the last 20 years of China-Africa engagement, we've seen a lot of Chinese migration to Africa, and with that also as Professor Lee has pointed out, this kind of like diffusion of who are Chinese actors on the continent, and with it the kind of heightened vulnerability of some Chinese actors on the continent. So, for example, we've seen a rapid increase in kidnappings over the last while of Chinese personnel working on various large-scale projects, including also kind of small business people and and people who are not working on large-scale projects but who happen to be doing business in Africa. So so that is one example of the kind of complexity of the Chinese presence here, the complexity of the BRI here, and the way that impacts then on peace and security issues. In the second place, we've also seen the rapid increase of non-state security providers on the continent. Obviously, South Africa has a massive amount of private security companies. It's a very big sector in South Africa. But we've also seen on the Chinese side the kind of growth of Chinese non-state security providers on the continent. So, for example, Paul Nantulia has recently shown that there's about 4.3 million people people employed by the private security sector in China. Many of those include former personnel members of the People's Liberation Army and other kind of security bodies in China. And a lot of that work includes working in Africa in providing security around Chinese projects. So, for example, about 2,000 security personnel were involved in guarding various kind of outposts of the Standard Gauge Railway in East Africa. So their presence in Africa provides an additional level of complexity when one thinks about what peace and security looks like under the BRI, and then raising questions about the role of governments and citizens, in relation to this presence. In the third place, we're seeing Chinese technology providers are becoming really prominent in peace and security initiatives in Africa, and particularly in the space where peace and security overlaps with policing and law enforcement. So, for example, Chinese technology companies are increasingly prominent providing safe city and smart city projects in Africa, which brings with them significant implications for law enforcement and for peace and security, not least, due to the rise of very large scale surveillance technology, frequently AI-powered surveillance technology. So that both offers a lot of kind of new tools, I think, for African governments to improve, local security and to feed into wider kind of peace and security implementation. But it also raises a lot of questions for African civil society about, exactly which governmental hands one is handing this technology to. So I think, I guess my I don't want to go on too long, but I guess I'll conclude with just, similar to You Shan, I think in a lot of cases, people like us who work on this in this field, we have to kind of draw all of these complexities together and start raising questions from them. And one of these questions is, to start to disaggregating who the actors are in this field, that beyond the basic kind of state-to-state interaction. In the second place, within this field of state-to-state interaction, what is the role of individual officials, and what is the role of, for example, the training of individual officials in creating a space for cooperation? To which extent does the connectivities offered by the BRI extend to actual cooperation on the ground? And then to which extent is this actual cooperation on the ground in Africa's favor? Are we seeing the kind of cooperation on the ground that Africa needs? And then finally, I think, how do these issues impact on economic development and job creation and other of these kind of pressing issues? As we've seen in South Africa over the last few months, there's no clear line to be drawn between economic development and peace and security. The lack of economic development in South Africa is a peace and security issue, and the unrest that we've seen over the last few months, I think, proved that, and then raise a lot of questions about how Africa is going to be working with external partners to provide a kind of a development-based form of security, which I think China is a major player in, not only in terms of its role as a economic growth partner and as a provider of these goods, but also in terms of the kind of intellectual goods that's generated by Chinese researchers, where the concept of developmental peace, I think has seen a lot more development than we've seen in a lot of other contexts. So, I think one of the issues is going to be to dissolve the siloing of these different issues and to show how issues like development, for example, directly impact issues of peace and security. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kovas. Some of the points you've raised that dovetail very nicely with what we've heard so far, and this morning as well. Connectivity as a word, we're using quite a lot, and when we start to unpack it and you say relating it to some of these issues as well, you realize too, as you say, just how complex some of these matters are coming, and that some of the things we often take for granted, like the prominence of the state in some of these security discussions is not actually there, because there's a large number of private security functions, which are, or private security involved quite as well, which is fascinating. We just have a little bit of time before I hand over to the next speaker. I just wondered if I could ask you just to unpack a little bit about some of the developmental impact of the BRI. And you mentioned, that it has it will have an impact on security. What sort of challenges do you imagine, or do you envisage, will be affecting the? I'm just struggling to put it in the right words, but I think the impact of the BRI will have a developmental effect, which will improve security. As you say, the lack of development is a peace and security issue in itself. But what other matters, or what other security issues might be a challenge in the future once, for instance, you have further connectivity through smart ports, for instance, and the cyber attacks, for instance, might be one thing. And might that impact on job creation and development, like you mentioned as well, that we do have a population increase forecast for most African countries, and there will be a need for this kind of developmental-driven economic growth and job creation. But what are some of the main security issues you also see potentially impacting?
I think some of these security issues include the differential levels or differential trajectories of development, where certain sectors of a population develop quicker than others, and some sectors of the population, particularly youth and particularly poor youth, find themselves left behind in development, even as an issue that is exacerbated by the kind of elite relationships that we frequently see, not only in the China-Africa relationship, but in many of Africa's kind of external relationships. So that, I think, is one issue. The other issue is kind of security challenges, I think, that might come also through the dissemination of different technologies, and then the differential kind of implementation of this technology. So over the last while, one of my acquaintances does a lot of research on the implementation of smart city and other kind of technology. And one of the challenges that he's pointed out, and that we also hope to feature in some of our work later, isn't the only issue. The issue isn't only that this technology might work too well, which I think has been the kind of kind of worry that a lot of civil liberties advocates have raised, that this will lead to widespread kind of pervasive surveillance, or the growth of a kind of a surveillance state, or the use of this technology to crack down on opposition figures or so. But we also see the kind of partial implementation, or the kind of faulty implementation of some of this technology, where cities end up. We've seen this, for example, in examples of it in Pakistan, where there's been widespread investment in this technologies, and then as a somewhat kind of like patchy response, or where we see kind of like certain aspects of it being hijacked by non-state actors, or by kind of actors within the state apparatus that use it for kind of personal enrichment or so. So kind of just simply because the technologies are being implemented don't mean they're necessarily going to be implemented in the way that they are functioning in China. So so in that sense, I think that's an interesting kind of like data point to keep an eye on. And kind of, but I think the bigger issue is this kind of issue of the kind of combination of complex connectivity driven by both state and non-state actors, and the way that it then lands in the kind of in a landscape of very differential development. Kind of where there's both a kind of a strong incentive to kind of move forward with these kind of technological, kind of interventions, while there's a lot of actors kind of desperately looking for ways to try and also make money out of these interventions, or kind of use them for, for little bits of graft on the side, or so on. So the kind of the way that it will then, that this technology could then impact on peace and security on the ground, I think becomes really challenging.
Oh, thank you. That's fascinating. It makes me think of what Dr. You Shan Wu was mentioning just about you've mentioned the uneven kind of distribution or differential development, and thinking back to questions around borrowing, credit rating, and how that will affect in the future as well. That this is a far more complex issue than is often appears right from the start. Thank you very much, Kurbas. I'd look forward to engaging with you a little more just now. But just now, excuse me, we're going to now hand over to our final speaker, Dr. Excuse me, Dr. Yu Jin. Please, sir, now the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. Thank you for invitation of the China Embassy in South Africa and ISS for inviting me here, and also congratulations for the 30th anniversary of ISS. It's great to have an opportunity to have a discussion here on all distinguished scholars in this field. So I think most of my points have been covered by speakers in the first session, and also the panelists in this session. But still, I want to repeat some points of mine. First of all, I think many scholars has emphasized, the feature of security in Africa. The concept of human security is more important, and we need to integrate development and security and governance together in dealing with the security challenge. So I will focus on that. Also combined with the Belt and Road Initiative as a key to construct a China-African security community. The Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, has been the main framework for China to conduct its foreign economic cooperation since 2013. Its African engagement has been made clear, I think, after the 2015 FOCAC Johannesburg summit, and has been presented in all the 8 major cooperation initiatives declared at the 2018 FOCAC Beijing summit. So we just witnessed the China-Africa economic and trade exhibitions here in China recently. So before that, the foreign officials has declared that despite the negative impact of COVID-19, the China-African bilateral trade amount to $139.1 billion in the first 7 months of this year, breaking the historical record. And China's FDI to Africa amount to $2 billion during the same period, during the same time, surpassing the level of 2019, also a historical record. So as China and Africa plan to have the next, FOCAC meeting in the Senegal later in this year, I think it's important to have a discussion on the role of Belt and Road BRI, in improving China-African security cooperation, which seems to me have lagged behind the faster development of the economic and the trade relationship between China and Africa. So in the first session, and the previous scholars in this panel, we have specified the challenges and opportunities for African-China security cooperation. So we can say an obvious, strong, there exists a strong governance security development nexus in African security. BRI. So I think a steadily advanced Belt and Road cooperation between China and Africa can bring a lot of things which are important to the security in Africa. The industrialization, the technology transfer, trade facilitation, and especially infrastructure connectivities, environment protections, capacity buildings, healthcare, and people-to-people, exchange. So all these things, I think, are very important to the security issues. Though essentially, they themselves are, mainly belongs to the developmental, area. So the African security problems nowadays, I think, not only could only be solved, as many scholars has mentioned before, is African solutions, to African problems. So Africans should be the drivers, should be decided. In the end, this problem should be solved by our African brothers and sisters. But Chinese approach to governance, which have been built up for a long time, could be helpful in many arenas, such as so anti-corruption, mainly related to the governance, the anti-epidemic in the past 2 years, and the poverty reduction, so which are very important issues domestically in China in recent years. Failure of these areas endeavors, could bring about a lot of problems. The security based on mainly essentially are, social, originated from the social problems or the human security issues, like the demonstrations, the riots, the drug trafficking, piracies, and even military coup in Africa in recent years, several places. So economic and social development embedded in BRI, it seems to me, can improve African countries' capabilities in dealing with this food crisis, healthcare shortage, and environment challenges, so on and so forth, these problems. So on the other hand, successful Belt and Road, cooperation between China and Africa can only be fulfilled by a much stronger and efficient, more effective China-African security cooperation in combating the prevailing, the terrorism, for instance, in Mali, in Chad, in Somalia, and reducing the rampant piracies in the Gulf of Virginia, and curbing the widespread hostage, human hostage in Nigerias, and improving this business friendly environment, which are also a problem nowadays facing the Chinese enterprise in Africa. So I think so. These are mutually enforced developments and the security is quite obvious. Then what kind of measures should we take? So I think in the previous session, Ambassador Sokolow has mentioned 5 approaches or 5 ways in dealing with this. I quite agree with him. It seems to me, first of all, the African security culture and the Chinese security culture, I think, are quite similar and parallel. In a sense, to you emphasize now, for instance, on human security, but China also emphasizes on the new security concept. The sustainable security, it's comprehensive security, it's common security, and cooperative security, so on and so forth. So it's quite supplementary, and think in the security of culture and ideas. I think I do not say the serious problem exists here. So bilaterally, mainly conducted on the governmental level, is BRI initiatives, are mostly important. So these projects usually are quite massive, and it's can mobilize the resources which are most important now for the infrastructure. investment. So we have a lot of modes on that. That's bilateral. I think we should emphasize on this level, and also multilateral levels. That's UN, EU, AU, so on and so forth. So in the multilateral arena, what I want to emphasize is it's not on the Belt and Road initiatives. What I want to emphasize is it's not exclusive. Even we mainly focus on the BRI now on the bilateral, but we have never excluded other parts in this kind of cooperation. So it could be a third party and multi-party cooperation around the BRI cooperation. I think they are welcome between China and, for instance, China and Japan and the UK and France and India in Africa, and even with the United States, which the China-U.S. strategic competition, made this kind of cooperation in the shadow maybe, but we are not exclusive. That's what I want to emphasize. To conclude, so I think the military and security cooperation, it seems to me, between China and Africa is a little bit, lag behind. So not, as I mentioned in the beginning, not quite, symmetry to this economic, relationship on the fast speed track. So we need to promote the political settlement of the hotspot issues in Africa, and China was prepared to help Africa enhance the peacekeeping and the counterterrorism capacity in a joint effort to build a more secure Africa. So BRI will play a key role in building a China-African community. It seems to me, development and security, like the two wings of a bird. That can make a bird can fly. Can make the China-U.S., the China, African security cooperation proceed more smoothly. So BRI provide a kind of a platform that can connect it, the development and security. So I stopped there. Thank you so much for your patience and listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Yu. We've got just a minute more or two just before we open for the question and answer session, which Gustavo will join me again for that. I thought I'd just ask you a quick question now, and it's actually something to put to the entire panel to consider as well. You mentioned that consultation security cooperation is perhaps not as strong as it needs to be. And this actually goes back to something that Professor Lee mentioned just now around the need for consultation meetings going forward. And I just wondered if you had any ideas or sort of ways you could forecast that would be very beneficial in terms of African countries and China discussing consultation on security matters going forward.
Some of my colleagues mentioned, like early warning, crisis management issues, which I think important to do at the current stage. It's kind of a challenge to the Chinese overseas enterprises. A lot of people worry about that. But it's very difficult actually to establish an efficient early warning and crisis management, system. Some scholars have mentioned that why it's so important, so difficult. There's so many actors. Some are quite, potential, and we never know when it will happen, why it happened. But it seems to me more important and more difficult now at the current stage is we lack kind of a connection, even domestic, in dealing with the issues of crisis management. You need to the cooperation between different agencies, for instance. You need the cooperation between the private enterprise and the state-owned private sectors, enterprises. And even between the state-owned enterprises, I don't think they have an efficient early warning system or crisis management measures. So it's quite difficult, actually. Even we think it's important and we need to build up such kind of system, but the capacity building and management crisis system establishment is quite difficult and time-consuming.
It is.
So I just mentioned that point.
No, thank you for that. It seems to align very well with actually the African peace and security architecture with early warning. You mentioned as well that there's quite a few, forgive my nautical metaphors, of a hook or an anchor here to get onto there in terms of China aligning with that, with what's going on in Africa for kind of those concrete safeguards. Gustavo, you've joined me on stage. Hand over to you.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the 4 panelists. This has been a really fascinating discussion and generated a lot of engagements on the chat. I could just ask if the 4 panelists could just put your video on so that we can all see you while we're making those comments. But we actually engaged on a wide number of issues online, and I wanted to categorize them in around 4 to 5 main categories. And I think certainly for a lot of the participants online, this issue around development, security, and the broader nature of understanding concepts is something that came very strongly. And when talking about the BRI, most of you spoke about the integration between China and the African continent, but to what extent that it's fostering integration within Africa on the one hand, or that can create more instability through competition. There's been some issues around how much that can actually generate more competition among global powers, particularly when you start dealing with competing priorities in terms of infrastructure, in terms of investments, in terms of interests in there. And there was one very specific question from our participants asking in terms of course, we're talking about security issues, but how does those issues around BRI can actually link to issues related to migration, trade, transport, issues around blue economy, environment, culture, and so on. There were some interesting points and some reactions, I think, particularly to what Dr. Cuevas was mentioning around this issue on again, and I mentioned that this morning about positionality of the Africans themselves, and to what extent do we continue seeing Africans as consumers rather than Africans as drivers, which links to some extent the idea of the disaggregating silos that Dr. Cuevas was mentioning earlier, and to what extent that disaggregation can help one seeing Africa in a more complex nature. Of course, as a continent with 54 member states, it is highly diverse, but so is China. It's a very diverse country with several interests within that particular country. But how can those make the engagements between Africa and China to then become more people-centered and moving beyond the role of the states? That links a little bit to, I think, what You Shan was mentioning earlier around the formalization, and maybe to potentially go deeper into this issue of the more linkages between the BRI and FOCAC, and how they can actually create a better sense of predictability, not only for China, but for Africans in particular. Sorry, I'll try to go brief so that you can have time to try to finish quickly here so you can have time to go back to the speakers. There was quite a lot of discussions about Djibouti and the Gulf of Aden, and to what extent this variety of actors with their bases in Djibouti can actually enhance and support, of course, the role of the BRI, but not increase competition amongst global powers. There were some questions around how much African stakeholders themselves are clearer of what they actually aim to gain from the BRI, and is there anything that can be done to better leverage common positions and aspirations in a more strategic, targeted, and coordinated way? And is the BRI creating some kind of a blockage for infrastructure that is coming from Europe and the US markets, and can they actually impact the global disputes that we often see happening? And final 2 points. One is quite a conceptual one around foreign policy. We had some participants somehow skeptical with the idea around an altruistic foreign policy and whether any country would be able to be entirely altruistic or entirely based on self-interest, and what are the balances that we can see in there in terms of the hard power interest that lies into engaging with a particular area, but also the soft power elements in there. Final comments and relates to the BRI beyond Eastern and Southern Africa, and how much that can actually impact the rest of the continents, the inland, and the questions were specifically asked towards potential impacts on the Sahel, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. So these were just some of the issues. It was quite an active discussion, so I hope you got the gist of a very interesting discussion we had. Thank you.
Thanks, Gustavo. Perhaps if we could just start off with maybe that final question, which is with something I meant to ask of everybody if there was a little more time earlier on. We're talking of Belt Road Initiative. You look at a map, it touches Kenya, it will have inland links as well, but it does seem to be very focused on East Africa. But undeniably or undoubtedly, this will have an impact on Central Africa, land-linked countries, and even then West Africa. Professor Lee, you were mentioning the Gulf of Guinea quite often, for instance, as well, and the links there. What could be the impact, or what could be the how will the Belt Road Initiative, as it develops over time, play out in Central, West, and even Southern Africa as well? Just some interesting thoughts to throw out there. Perhaps if we, I don't know if anyone would like to go first, but otherwise I would suggest order of speakers again. Please unmute yourself, or do speak if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, this is my turn to answer this question.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, you talk about and maybe BRI, and I think you talk about East African, yes, and currently, and China have more engagement, economic, maybe and political and security cooperations with the East African countries. And if you compare it with other regions and the Southern Africa, but I think maybe it is a misunderstanding, and we have we see the whole continent. It is really important, no matter it's West or East, and the North or the South. But you know, the three factors and the influence and the Chinese, to my own understandings, influence China's and the foreign policies in Africa. The first is distance, because you know the East African, it is near to China. So I think it is more convenient for China to have more exchanges and with these countries. The second is language, and most of the Eastern and African countries and the Southern African countries speak English. It's English countries. So, you know, in China, and there's so many people can speak English, but there's so few people can speak and French, Portuguese. I think it is really important and factor for China. The third, I think maybe is a historical reason or political reason. That is, you know, and many of the Eastern or the Southern African countries, these countries experience the socialisms for the ruling parties. So I think maybe, and China and these countries, we have the similar, not the same, but similar and philosophies, political philosophies. So it maybe can, and we can have a more close and exchanges and between China and these countries. But I think now China have pay more attentions and to the Western African countries. And for example, in this forecast, Senegal and will be the host and Africans host, and China invest a lot and in Nigeria and in Guinea. It is very important. So I think China wanted to have a balance and African policy, but because of the distance, maybe culture, language issues, and the historical, political philosophies, and we have maybe different political or distance and with these countries. So that is my point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It takes me back to one of the initial points around looking forward, but also reflecting on the journey we've taken so far. I'm not sure if anybody else would like to pick up on that question, or indeed one of the points Gustavo raised as well. Please feel free. I think, You Shan, I can see you looking like you're ready to speak, so over to you.
Just to respond to your question about emphasis on East Africa, etc. I think, yes, I think when the BRI was first announced in 2013, we were very much fixated on the set routes and maps that were coming out and how Africa was specifically linked through East Africa. But I think that has somewhat changed. I think also with China, I think rebranding the initiative from a One Belt, One Road to the Belt and Road Initiative. But I don't think this is only on China's terms. I think what has happened is also an alignment of interests. So I think you start to see, I think 2015, when Agenda 2063 comes out, we start to see a lot more discussion on industrialization and agenda for supporting in Agenda 2063 in the FOCAC agenda. I think the Belt and Road Initiative was hardly mentioned in 2015 and then increasing in 2018. So I do think we also have a role, or African countries and African partners have a role in determining what the future links to the Belt and Road Initiative is. And I think my intervention was really asking what we want that future to look like. At the moment, it is very much based on industrialization and current interests such as transport infrastructure. But I think we need to think in terms of the future as well. And a lot of the speakers talked about some of the risks and security issues that may come up that we need to, I think, include into the relationship. I also think, I mean, we ourselves as part of the epistemic community, and I said this elsewhere, have also contributed to what the Belt and Road Initiative means to Africa. We I think there is still, we talk about it at events such as this, and I think that also helps build meaning to what it is. So I think, I think, as I said earlier, we need to be there needs to be a lot more understanding about what Africa thinks about and what it wants when it engages the Belt and Road Initiative, rather than set specific routes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate what you're saying about the enduring nature of it, and it seems to have a flexibility as well, which, with a rebranding and an application today, has seen it in a sense revive. What I'd like to do is maybe just direct a question to Professor Yu, and then perhaps Courbis, if you would like to come in afterwards as well, if you respond to anything you've heard the other speakers say so far, but also Gustavo. That it actually links to what you were saying, You Shan, about, and what Gustavo had from the comments, about the kind of the blockages which may occur. And Professor Yu, you were making a very interesting point about how it's not exclusive. You know, the BRI, in terms of it's not a mutually exclusive kind of setup. It is designed in a sense with African development priorities in mind, where they align and are harmonized. But could you just expand on a little more on that, about the non-exclusive nature as well? Because I think that will tackle some of the comments which were addressed by Gustavo.
Yes, sir. Actually, different countries have different advantages. For instance, in Southeast Asia, So the Japanese has done a lot of theirs, and all Belt and Road cooperation could be done with some Japanese companies, actually. So in the history, we not a BRI. So in the peacekeeping missions under the United Nations in the early 1990s, actually China and Japanese, the peacekeeping forces could cooperate and coordinate it quite well, even though we have a very serious historical problems. So look at Africa. There are many countries which have a very strong impact and influence, having influence in here because of history, like French, like British, and non-American and Indians and some places Japanese and Portuguese. So and China want to expand the BRI initiatives in some areas, like they have a strong relations with other countries. So why not coordinate? Even as I mentioned, in the shadow of the strategic competition between China and the United States, but we do have coordinated quite successfully in the P5 framework in the Somali waters, in the Aden patrollings. So why not think about to coordinate to provide some, if we can provide as a public goods, like the anti-piracies, in some places. So I just raised an instance for that. Under the Trump administration, the issues in 2018, the African strategy, targeting on China, so as the #1 challenge of a strategic competitor of the United States. And they even expand this kind of strategic competition in African continent. But that's not all thinking. So as State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi has mentioned several months ago, this is not a playground for the game of major powers, Africa. So that's my answer.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, because it was a fascinating point, especially when you're using the term shadow and talking then of the Gulf of Aden and anti-piracy issues. And responses, that you have what's called the SHADE mechanism, the shared awareness and deconfliction, which was lauded when it was launched, because it was an initiative where China, the US, and various countries would convene and obviously share and deconflict. And it takes me back to one of the ambassador's points right in the beginning of the concrete actions which have been taken, and another point which Gustavo raised, which had come from the comments and the chat so far, about the Djibouti infrastructure and the base, or the actions which have been taken there. And now, again, returning to that image of the shadow or the shade, these were constructed or undertaken in the shade or the with the overwhelming shadow of piracy threatening shipping throughout the region. Now, piracy off Somalia has, for all intents and purposes, not been a major peace and security issue for a long time now. So it does raise some interesting questions about the future, and I think the future role of the Djibouti base in safeguarding some of the Belt Road initiatives going forward. It's something which I'm not really phrased, I think, very well as a question, but to put it out there in case you'd like to pick up on it, or on anyone to respond. But we still have about a few minutes left, and I've neglected Kurbas for a long time now. Kurbas, is there anything you'd like to pick up on what other people have said so far, or the points that Gustavo raised earlier? Please, the floor is yours.
Just picking up on You Shan's point that the conception of the BRI has also shifted over time. As she pointed out, in a few years ago, it was really kind of thought of as set roots, and at that stage also like very strongly emphasized, as an infrastructure provision initiative. Since then, we've seen the BRI kind of like shifting into other fields, and also responding to new realities. So for example, I think the BRI is actively responding to the COVID-19 epidemic, and I expect this year's FOCAC, we'll see a different kind of BRI, popping up than the one we saw, 3 years ago. So in that respect, I think it's really important for African actors, African governments particularly, to think of the BRI that they would like, the one that particularly kind of like suits them, and for example, we see this week there was I think it's still going on, a massive trade expo that's happening in Changsha in Hunan province in China, and this is particularly an expo focusing on African trade, and we've seen the kind of announcement of a whole bunch of new deals and the setting up of Changsha as a space as a kind of a clearinghouse almost for African agricultural trade. So, we're seeing these kind of massive deals to ship coffee and chili peppers and kind of other kind of agricultural commodities from various African countries to Changsha, from where it would then kind of get sold and onwards. So the kind of hooking of trade, for example, the hooking of something like the development of agri-processing as a sector, as an employment sector in Africa, which again, as we pointed out, kind of a slightly more diffuse view of peace and security, these kind of like job creation and development initiatives have very real peace and security implications. It then is open to African governments to push for a kind of an application of a specific BRI model that really suits all of these preoccupations that also that are very high on the list in Africa. So so in that sense, I think it's important to kind of to encourage us to kind of work within the broadest understanding of the BRI, because that is the space at which the BRI actually does function. So in that sense, kind of pulling in peace and security, putting in development, pulling in the development of particular kind of economic sectors as part of a wider kind of BRI cooperation project, I think is open to African nations, to African policymakers particularly, and hopefully we will see some of those kind of developments in FOCAC this year. But I think we're already seeing some of it developing from actors like Rwanda, for example, who've been very proactive in hooking their own kind of national development agendas to these kind of bigger kind of apparatuses like the BRI.
Yeah, and that dovetails with what Sanusha Naidu was mentioning as one of the keynote speakers earlier as well, in terms of meeting halfway of the African agency aspect of this, linking it up to what You Shan mentioned and has been throughout the Agenda 2063, that there are these initiatives which are now coming together, but it still always requires continual focus. I'm saying FOCAC there, focus, and political attention and political will, which is integral. Now, we have about 3 minutes left. Now, Gustavo, is there anything else that you would like to mention just yet in terms of the comments that we have missed, or any additional ones? Oh, nothing. Okay. In that case, then, what I'd like to do is just ask very briefly, maybe for about half a minute, if each speaker can offer their final thoughts on this, if it's the future of the BRI in 10 years' time, or some of the main issues for FOCAC. It'd be fantastic to leave on that. I'd like to thank you all for your words today and for the engagement. And I would like to go in again in the order in which we spoke. So You Shan, over to you, and then we'll go down the speaker line. Thank you.
Sure. One last point I would make is, so far when we look at Africa and the Belton Road Initiative, there have been a lot of parallels between the two. So again, if you think about Africa's focus on industrialization and transport infrastructure, the language is very similar to the kind of things that I think China's original white paper on the BRI in 2015 mentioned. So I think they were very much an alignment of interests. And I suppose the question is whether these interests will continue to evolve and parallel as time goes on. Something that I've been interested in recently is also the idea of, foreign policy ideas and how some seem to just simply fall away, such as the concept of the Asia Pacific, and how some actually continue to have a life of its own. And I think the BRI is an interesting case study here because it hasn't just become an idea that's captured, I think, the interest of the epistemic community and academia. It continues to be mentioned at conferences, etc. But what are the ways that it has actually ensured that it has existed from simply an idea? And it is through things such as institutionalization, the fact that the agenda does evolve and tries to respond to new issues. And yet again, the question is whether it will continue to do so. I will leave it there. Thanks.
The dynamic nature of this.
Okay.
Professor Lee, over to you.
Okay, and Professor Walker. I was saying that, and I just want to repeat an argument, and that is BRI is just a public good proposed by China, but I think it can benefit. Its benefit can be shared by African countries, and I think you just reform the win-win. And you think maybe some African countries think and China win more and maybe win less. I think, and from my understandings, and Chinese government or Chinese officials, scholars, they really want win-win solutions for our cooperation, because only win-win models can be sustainable and not just one win. And secondly, I want to say, and please do not exaggerate and the BRI's strategic roles, and we cannot just think the BRI as some geopolitical issues. I think it's totally different. So most of people always linked the BRI to Djibouti. They think maybe Djibouti will have some maybe security engagement there or military engagement there to protect only Chinese interests. And because of the time limited, I don't want to explain more. But I think you can see what happened in Ethiopia and what happened in Sudan, what happened in Somalia. Do you think China will send our troops to there? I don't think so. And of course, Ethiopia is really important for China. And even Sudan. Bashir, some Western countries think Bashir is a good friend of China, now overthrown. Do you think we will send? I don't think so. So I think maybe sometimes we cannot exaggerate. It is a really dangerous idea. And third, I think also African countries can have your African BRI solutions. You can have African BRI models, and China will also support and cooperate and accept the ideas. So I think maybe it will be sustainable, and we can have bright and futures for us, for China and African relations. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I can see the like I say, the buzzword nature of it often means, like I've said about hooks, it means a lot of things to a lot of people, and we need to be a lot clearer on those implications. Thank you. Corbus, over to you.
Very briefly, I would just add that I think I completely agree with Professor Lee that there's a lot of space for African governments to decide on how they would like to cooperate with the BRI. I think that there's a lot of scope there, and I think maybe one place to start thinking is how to maximize positioning within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Kind of what Africa would like to achieve, how particularly different African states would like to cooperate in order to achieve kind of cross-cutting benefits that actually would benefit regional economic communities and on a broader scale the entire continent, and then look at the different options that are open for BRI, kind of engagement. I think there are a lot of options, but for them to make sense, they would have to lead from an African kind of developmental strategic perspective, because that I think is the only perspective that really makes sense for the continent from which to move forward.
Absolutely, yes, the positioning of that within the narrative. Last but not least, Professor Yu, the final brief word for you, and then we will finish our event today. Thank you very much, Professor Yu.
Thank you, Dr. Walker. I think it's important to integrate, development and the security in our cooperation. So to keep a balance between these two things can make the development more sustainable, and while making the security more solid. So I think China and I hope China can and African could stand by stand, shoulder by shoulder and hand in hand to get it right. So with regard to the security cooperation, actually, my feeling is that we are at the quite early stage. So we need to integrate the ideas, the security ideas, new security concept, and actions plans, and also the capacity and system building, all these three-level things. I'm quite look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for all your time and words. Thank you very much. Gustavo, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the speakers. Thank you, Tim. I'll give you the time to give the final words, but just to remind our participants that are joining us online that this is the session 2 of this 2-day event, and we're joining back tomorrow morning South African time, 10 a.m. South African Standard Time, and 4 p.m. China Standard Time, and we're going to be discussing a lot of issues that are already being part of the 2 sessions today, but the China-Africa security cooperation, particularly in multilateral spaces. Tim, back to you.
Thanks. I'll briefly conclude then just to say that it's been a fascinating conversation. Really enjoyed listening to speakers, especially, like I say, people who have been producing knowledge, the systems of knowledge which Dr. Kum mentioned earlier in the introduction, which are crucial for us as optics, think of them as a pair of glasses, for looking at these matters and taking forward. South Africa and China have a long-standing relationship now. There is a huge amount of academic as well as policy knowledge available to read up further on this, because this was never a one-off conversation. It's always a long-term and dynamic conversation, as we've heard from many speakers as well. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to be asked to chair this session. Thank you to the organizers, the Embassy of the People's Republic of China, and the ISS, and I wish you all a very good rest of the day and stay safe. Thank you very much.